maybe we'll just save that for a moment. I'm just going to hit record now, okay? Okay, that's better. Just because I think we just can fly into the conversation now anyway. I was saying just a moment ago on that note, like that we're all in the same boat at the moment. So today's April the 5th. We're on day 14 of the coronavirus lockdown.
What strange times.
Strange times. So with that, I had a really nice, interesting thought today. You saying about we're all in the same boat, and I feel like it's brought a real like sense of like I already knew it was building a sense of community, like this lockdown, but I had a nice, interesting thought that this lockdown is creating a real unity of love because we're looking after each other by staying in at home. We're actually caring for each individual person. We're not, you know, we don't ever do anything, you know, in our society that is benefiting really other humans, like except from like yoga teachers, holistic practitioners, you know, okay, some philosophers, you know, to a certain extent, etc. But like normally it's done for your own self, but not others. So it's a really nice moment. It's like karma yoga. It is karma yoga. Everyone staying indoors is karma yoga.
You hear stories of a few like silly people that are breaking the rules or breaking the recommendations rather, but it seems like on the whole most people are sort of understanding, they're willing. You know, it's, you know, the government kind of threatened the police force or whatever to, you know, to sort of impose the rules. But I think on generally speaking, most people understand and they're following the rules. And it's strange at the park, like going for a dog walk or something. It's that thing of there's obviously camaraderie, but you kind of acknowledging people from afar, you know.
Yeah.
It's strange, but yeah, like you said, there's sort of a group. It's not even just England, is it? It's a world.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
You know, sort of unite it. It goes to show how, in fact, we are. You know, it's a small world after all.
Yeah, no, it is, and we've said that before, haven't we? Talking together, how much of a small world it seems in respect. Even when looking back, I feel like when we have these talks about history and yoga history, it makes you feel feel that essence of the world being so small and like quite united in many ways.
Yeah.
Because
this stuff gets in terms of like yoga history and stuff. The most interesting parts I find, like studying it, is seeing where things like are misinterpreted or they overlap, or a translation is a bit off, or things develop like completely independently almost, or like that lineage back. I think that point where like tantric Buddhist practice becomes a Hatha practice, like 11th century onwards. I think it's safe to say that we see like development of Hatha practice, but sort of pre-11th century, like the Amrita City manuscript. It gets all a bit sort of Buddhist and tantric and a bit sort of almost Taoist, like a different culture. And it's only sort of coming towards the 15th century where we get sort of Shaiva-based Hindu Hatha practices that are like firmly established. It's all like a melting pot. You know, still to this day, there are things changing, people's understanding is shifting. Like before, I think people thought it's an Indian Hindu practice. And it just doesn't seem to be the case. You know, the further you go back, or even though, you know, in terms of modern yoga as well, we've got lots of European influence and, you know, Western gymnastics and things. You know, it's all a big mixing pot, really. You know.
So do you think that like there could be a relation between Taoism and the beginning of tantric practices?
Yeah, I think. I think the text and the um, there's crossover with like chakras and stuff. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, things are spoken about, and it takes a while to establish, but it's nothing new. Like, Hinduism is well known for incorporating things from different lineages,
Yeah, even different religions almost, really.
like vegetarianism is a good example as well. And like you go back and you kind of go back history in pre 11th century. It gets Buddhist and Tantric, and then you've got Jains, all the Jain texts and stuff, and there's a crossover in terms of. It's interesting if you like. I'm not an expert on Jainism or Jains, but in terms of modern, I think we've spoken about this before, like modern veganism and stuff. It's nothing new. The Jains are doing it all those thousands of years ago. They wouldn't even. I think I'm imagine saying they wouldn't even walk on the grass in terms of wanting to protect animals and stuff. And I've heard that you still see
them
like sweeping the floor as they walk to avoid standing on things, and they think they understand that it's not possible to get every single thing out of the way, but the gesture of doing it is enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's that karma of like that will to do it, just to even that intention. Because sometimes, like even in the kind of modern scriptures of like Hatha yoga, like just that sense of trying and doing something with good intent and heartful intent is seen as like karmically good, even if it doesn't have a good implication. Like for example, there's different types of karma, but there's obviously different types of ways of perceiving like what is negative karma and what is positive karma. For example, when you, I don't know, I was going to use coronavirus as an example, but that's not kind of maybe evidently backed. But, say, okay, for example, you try to compliment someone or you try to do someone a favor or you do someone a favor, but it backlashes on you, then often that can be perceived as like, okay, that didn't have a direct positive impact on me, but the intention was good. Or it didn't have a direct positive impact on someone else because they didn't take it as a compliment, for example. When you tell your partner, oh, you look really nice today, and they're actually feeling really shit, and they're like, oh, and then it has the reverse effect.
But it's this like it's sort of a modern association, like wanting to be a good member of society in terms of yoga practice. You go back and yogis were outside of society. They had nothing to do with ordinary culture, and you would take yourself away in a heart and you practice alone, and there isn't this focus on. It's not a world affirming like if you take yoga practice you will be a nicer person to people. That's very much like a modern meaning post 15th century. Not that modern, but modern in terms of attitudes to yoga. Perhaps we should talk about the difference between Hatha yoga and Hatha yoga.
Yeah, okay, that'd be nice. Maybe then before doing that, we could just explain a little bit about where the word Hatha comes from.
Well, crudely speaking, it means force, and it's sort of seen as an extreme practice that when all other forms of yoga have failed you, you take Hatha practice. It means kind of like like force or power is not the right word, but it's sort of like a stoic kind of extreme thing. Whereas you can see that I'm not quite sure how the difference in pronunciation is a good like metaphor for the description changing almost of where Hatha becomes Hatha. I think modern studios Hatha is seen as like a relaxed, easy postural practice. But the original word is force, and it's extreme and
it's very much awakening. It means because it means both sun and moon together. So that is a powerful force together, which is awakening the Kundalini. So it's very, like you're saying, it's very much an energetic practice to try and awaken something within.
And there are things, it's essentially most of the texts talk about yoga assisting in celibacy. There's this obsession with controlling semen. They equate semen to life force and energy, and the idea that you take practices in order to keep life force, bindu or rajas, semen or uterine fluid, in the body in order to sort of keep that fire. And it's where mudras that later get described as bandhas come into play, in terms of you'd take a lock in a certain part of the body in order to stop the life force, like the nectar like dripping down. I think we spoke about it before, like the inversion, the Shirshasana and things like that. It's about keeping the energy in the head. So like it's a really crude way, you invert yourself to stop the energy, life force
Dripping.
like dripping down, So there's lots of inversions, there's lots of mudras and bandhas
And lots of cleaning exercises as well, lots of kriya.
Lots of things that there's some bizarre practices now that like Khechari Mudra, which is, I didn't think it was possible. Like I read it in text and thought there are quite a few things that are just impossible in the older texts. And I thought this Khechari Mudra was impossible until I googled it, and there are people practicing it, and it's a common, fairly popular thing where you take your tongue back and up into behind your palate. And so you've obviously got that little, I forget the medical term for that, little
string bit.
piece of skin like in the way. So there's this description of how you'd cut that, repeatedly cut that and rub salt on it in order to get the length needed to bring the tongue back. And there's all such weird descriptions where you'd grab your tongue with a iron clamp, and then pretty strange stuff that you don't see in modern studios. When you see, makes me laugh when they say like, come to Tuesday's Hatha class. I think, oh, there's no one's doing Khechari Mudra or whatever, but there are things that have died out and aren't as popular, but there are quite a few things that we practice today, probably different names, different descriptions, but like the fundamentals of there.
Yeah, definitely. And also, like, I think that it's important to recognize that actually, like, which I'm sure we could actually go to talk around, but the original Hatha yoga practice was actually, when they described sitting in asana, that actually meant sitting in a cross-leg position. That actually meant sitting in meditation a lot of the time. When you read a lot of the text. It's like sitting in asana or doing asana was actually meant doing meditation.
Yeah. Or, you know, the root asked to sit, you know, on the ground, and yeah, maybe talk about, you know, a lot of the texts. So this is pre-vinyasa flow.
Definitely. This is more like I've read in many times in like Swami Shivananda's books, like about daily like routines, and they're crazy. Like some of these routines, like I was reading some of them the other night. It was like get up at 3:30, do asana, which actually meant meditate, and then you know, some other meditation practices. It says about some involvement in chanting, but this went on from 3:30 in the morning till, you know, like 12 midday. And then it was a little bit of rest, and then it was more of that.
When it was a full-time occupation, they weren't, you know, there's this term householder used in traditional yoga,
Yeah.
and it's seen as like a diss, like, oh, even householders can do this, meaning you lived in a house, you lived with a family or whatever, and prior to that you were away in your hut somewhere taking practices that all day you're sitting around your fire. It's only relatively late. I think the Hatha in the 15th century talks about householders being able to practice too, and it being beneficial.
Definitely.
It's yeah, it's all complicated, strange,
Yeah.
convoluted, but there's things, you know, I suppose I'm looking for it, but there's often times where things practiced in modern Ashtanga system or attitude to practice, should we say, appears in old texts, and you know, certain postures, and Mayurasana is the 10th century. Kukutasana is also one of the oldest written descriptions of postures we have. So there are a few parallels and crossovers, and even sort of Iyengar and Ashtanga and Tavi Joyce, and you know, they're taking bits and pieces from the older texts. You know, Krishnacharya used to reference, you know, he was a great scholar and he knew all the Vedic literature, and you know, he was well versed in ancient texts, and he'd talk about Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and the Hatha in terms of the attitude towards practice. So these aren't texts that are just forgotten about and we move on and it's all lost. There's cross references, and you know, they're still relevant today.
Yeah, definitely. And have you been going a little bit further back in the course that you've been studying on, further back than the Hatha Yoga Padapika now, or are you still linger around that time frame?
I'm still sort of Hatha practices, like earliest like 11th century, but like I said, pre then it gets a bit Taoist and a bit messier, shall we say, in terms of not being technically Hatha Yoga. But at the moment, today I was rereading A.G. Mohan and his wife. He wrote a book, essentially like the life and times of Krishnacharya. So I'll sort of go back and forth. You know, I read a translation of an old Sanskrit text, and then I'll jump back into a modern thing and like look for
Parallels.
connections and things. Like, I've gotten a few old Indra Devi books who it's not something I know a great deal about, but she was a really important American female practitioner who I think I'm right in saying that Krishnacharya, she was one of the first
women, was it? Was it the women?
female,
Yeah, female.
females like Western or otherwise, or like, to be taught by him, and he kind of gave her permission to spread these teachings.
I think she had a couple ashrams, didn't she? She had one in like
Yeah,
California, I think.
there's good pictures of her like hanging out outside of it, and it's like really nice, like typography, like, just really simple, like yoga lessons this way and a sign, you know. Um, but I think, you know, I think it's reasonable to say that she feminized practices to a certain extent.
You know what year she was like practicing with Krishnamacharya? Like what kind of, just to give us a little bit of a time frame? Do you know?
Well, I think he was in his 80s when he was teaching her. And a lot of her books are published in the 60s,
Yeah.
Mid to late 60s. It's when she was at her peak, I think. It's the California, LA type.
That still that sort of like 50s sort of time, wasn't it? 50s, 60s, because I do remember reading that I think apart from her, like there was people allowed to go and stay at the Divine Life Society in Rishikesh like around the 40s, 50s as well. And that was only that he allowed women to come in at one point.
I know that the Shivananda Yoga Center is one of the first yoga centers in London.
Yeah.
And they had, I think they sort of took over a house, like a
Yeah, they
just
did.
ordinary semi or whatever. And then they were teaching just on the floor. And it's interesting, even then they're still practicing on rugs and blankets.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, I was thinking today that you could, rather than saying sort of Hatha and Hatha as a distinction between old and new, you could see it as sort of pre-sticky mat yoga and post-sticky mat yoga. Because it's relatively late that you need a mat as a prerequisite to practice. And
Oh, yeah.
you know, Krishnamacharya in the 30s and 40s it was all carpets and rugs and things. And if you're used to practicing on a sticky mat and you go back to a carpet or rug, it's very different
So different.
practice. You know, you don't have that support with it. And I think I'm right in saying that the origins of the sticky mat are from an Iyengar student. I think she had some form of ectodermal dysplasia, I think it's called, which is where your sweat glands don't function properly. So she couldn't like get a grip on the carpets or whatever. So she got a special mat made or cut up a piece of vinyl or something and obviously found it easier. And then from this one Iyengar class, all the other people started adopting, oh, this is easier. And then before you know it, you know, nowadays, if you don't have a mat, you're not practicing yoga, are you?
No. Have you practiced on a rug? Do you have a rug?
Yeah, or sometimes just put this blanket out, and if I'm just doing pranayama techniques or inversions, like headstands and stuff, I'll just use the blanket. But
What about to do your like Surya Namaskar? Do you use the blanket?
no, I use the mat.
Yeah.
No, it's not. My own practice is pretty modern. You know, it's
Yeah.
You know, I incorporate a few of the Hatha practices. I see mostly sort of, I say I'm a modern sort of Ashtanga-ish practitioner. Would be days where pretty much every other day I'll do this sort of modern strict Ashtanga sequence, and then intermittently I'll just do Hatha practices or pranayama practices, or more of a sort of looser Krishnacharya approach. It's interesting, you look at how Krishnacharya taught his warrior sequence, if you're Vajrasana B or 2, is very different to Patabi Joyce's version.
Why is that?
You could, well, you sort of, the Krishnacharya like to take the hands out, and then you'd flip your palms up, then you'd look back at your hand, and then you'd go up in sort of a warrior 3 type thing on one foot, and then come back down. It's a different practice, but you can see the overlap. Like recently, I thought I'll try and find out like when modern Ashtanga sequence was developed, like, in terms of the date and stuff. And it seems no older than, I think it's 1941. Krishnacharya writes down a sequence, publishes it in this book, and it's very similar to the modern primary series, with the exception of Uddhva bow pose, and a few others. With the linking vinyasa.
Between the asana.
We should maybe talk about prior to Krishnacharya.
Yeah, what it was like.
Asana was held for longer, and they weren't connected. So,
or linked together at all.
Yeah, you'd do Shishasana headstand, and then you'd come back down, and you'd probably sit for a while, and then you'd do Kukutasana or something that was separate. And Krishnacharya introduced vinyasa where you would move from one posture to another posture in the sort of the type of yoga you'd see in a modern studio today, of a transition from one
A vinyasa class.
other side and things,
Am I right in saying that he did that because he was very much influenced by the gymnastics and modern exercise, like modern Western exercise?
Yeah, it has been. Dr. Mark Singleton, in his book Yoga Body, talks about Krishnacharya's references, and there's a great picture of Krishnacharya's yoga shala, and you can see how multicultural it is. He's got a set of dumbbells, a rowing machine, like a primitive one with springs and things, and it's said that some British colonial that gave him the rowing machine, and because the British were in India for a long time, it's said that he might have witnessed military drills, military warm-ups in terms of movement, and there's an argument with Swedish gymnastics gets was about, but there's an argument that perhaps it's more to do with the physical limitations of the body rather than, you could argue that contortionists and gymnasts are appropriating yoga practices, but I think it's more to do with there's only so far
Anatomically, you can bend.
Yeah, there's only so much movement in the body is capable of. But there's no doubt that Krishnacharya was exposed to different cultures, and even at the time there was in the early days of Mysore and Patabi Joyce, there was a sort of Western um, exercise bodybuilder gym, like across the road.
From the Shala.
Yeah, pretty much. And people would go back and forth, or the exercise people would come and learn a few asanas. So these things were going on at the same time. And
Do you not think that though it's quite reflective of like what the Ashtanga practice is? That it's not surprising that people who go to the gym like Ashtanga, is it? Because it's very, it's very asana based. Like, well, modern Ashtanga is anyway. I don't know how much influence, how much Krishnamacharya was influenced by any pranayama exercises. Like, I've not really heard you talk about him mentioning pranayama much.
Yeah, but Krishnamacharya's teachings are very different to Pattabhi Jois's teachings.
Yeah, sorry, I was referring to Pattabhi Jois actually, talking about pranayama actually, yeah, sorry.
Well, it's sort of, yeah, there isn't too much of a focus on it. And I think traditionally, you'd only get shown Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, like the beginning of second series, which you had to sort of have to learn the primary series first. But I think that's changing nowadays. But yeah, there's, I think perhaps from the outside in, Ashtanga world, it seems just people obsessed with posture practice and asana, and there obviously are people that we have to sort of take each case on its own merit, obviously, but there are certain the benefits, if you like, of the Ashtanga sequences, because it's set. Inevitably, there'll be postures that people find difficult or they don't like,
And they have to do them.
and so they have to control their breath and all the other, I think, mind control and all the other things that are seen as traditional parts of yoga in terms of laid out in terms of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. They have to practice those in order to manage a difficult pose almost. But it can get a bit, if I look at it objectively, it can get a bit silly, this focus on do this set sequence, and if you do left foot first, it's not right, and lots of silly rules. But there are people that need rules and they thrive on discipline and stuff. You know?
I think especially for the way we've built society, I think before when you was practicing yoga, that's all you was doing, like we were saying, or you was a householder, and maybe it was, if you was already practicing asana, you would be opened up to all these different practices, all of these different kriyas. It's not just about asana, asana, asana. So he was practicing a wide variety of things. I don't know what's going with that, but I think that it's quite important to have that discipline now for people and to be able to fit it in. I really like the fact that Ashtanga has a sequence and they've stuck by that and they've not changed that in any way, because in many ways what I've been taught is the same, but it's just a different sequence and focuses on different practices as well. But I have one question for you, Ash. I wonder why, and I'm just using Pattabhi Jois as an example. There's many more modern yoga gurus that have done this, but I wonder why he didn't include all of those other practices, all those other yoga, hatha yoga practices, and he just stuck with like.
Well, in terms of,
I'm more referring to Pattabhi Jois now, not really Krishnamacharya, but also Krishnamacharya in some way, I guess.
I know in England, Iyengar was the first modern yoga guru to be given the sort of government approved stamp of you're allowed to teach Westerners or people, and it comes from these evening classes in England, which you could go learn pot making or something after work as an evening class. And the chap that was in charge of giving you this government approved stamp. I think his name was Peter Intosh, I remember. It doesn't matter. But he had a sort of exercise military background. And I think I'm right in saying that he went to observe Iyengar teaching a group class. And he sort of said, yeah, you can teach the asanas, but sort of drop some of the psychology stuff and the theory stuff. We can get rid of some of that, but yeah, pranayamas, we can keep that, we can keep some asana stuff. And then you've got my permission to teach, to go on and teach, set up schools and so on. And I think it's much the same in the Pattabhi Joy system in that there's probably a time restriction. You know, you've got an hour's block.
Yeah, of course, definitely a time restriction as well.
People want to show up and they do their practice. And
but I'm referring to like people who go on to like learn about these things. You know, people go to Mysore and study there. There's kind of an element. There's not really an element of time restriction there, is there? In some ways, because people are going to study with a person. You're going to study in an environment. I think it's the same. I think it is the same even with the Shivananda. But now I think about it, maybe it's because again, the more you have, the more radical practices you have, the less attractive it's going to be to the masses.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's a whole field in itself in terms of looking at the reason why posture practice became popular and is what most people think of when they think of yoga today. It was interesting. I was sitting waiting for a train, and like a British Indian chap said, "How do you?" He said something like, "Why do you sit like this? How do you sit like this?" And I laughed and I said, "Oh, I practice yoga," thinking, "Oh, that would be the end of the conversation." And his first question wasn't, like, "Which studio do you go?" His first question was, "Are you vegetarian?" Which I laughed and said, "Yeah, of course." And but it was interesting that for him, he understood this connection between ahimsa and the yamas and yamas and the traditional values that the prerequisite to even approaching doing the asana.
Yeah, for sure.
Perhaps even a Westerner who said, "I do yoga," they'll say, "Oh, can you stand on your head or something?"
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. Oh, there is this connection, but there isn't, and it's not right in saying that in India it's a spiritual practice and we took it in the West and stripped any.
No, I don't think it is a case of that.
Because even in the old text that in the 15th century talk about body cultivation, and if you do certain asanas, you'll get a slim body, or your hair will go grey, and you'll live longer. Women will find you attractive and things. It's nothing new. But I think in studying the older texts, I'd like to see some adoption of more traditional practices. Yeah. A scholar was telling me that in yoga today, the traditional yogis are beginning to draw a distinction between traditional yoga practice and modern practitioners. And the Sanskrit is yoga, but in Hindi you drop the final A, so it becomes yog. And the traditional yogis are saying that what we practice is yog, and what they're doing in the West is yoga, you know, with the mats and so on. So there's already a distinction being drawn.
But what sort of people are saying that though?
These sort of non-householders, the Kumbh Melas and things like this. Yeah. But yeah, you're right to question authority, and there's I'm guilty of it as well, like an inverse racism thing where if it's an older chap and he's Indian, oh, that must be real yoga, and
Yeah.
it's not. There is many. Um, there are people um, across the board in all cultures. Just because something looks right doesn't necessarily mean it's authentic or traditional.
Definitely. And I actually think, like, the more and more I think about it today, right now, the reason we're practicing yoga mostly is because of these, I hate to call them gurus, because I'm not sure if they really are gurus anymore. They are, because they brought light to a place, and they shed light on teachings. But the more and more I question, like, it's not that the West, got rid of all of the, the mind stuff. Really, it is that they got rid of all of that. They got rid of all of, not just the mind stuff, but the deeper philosophies of yoga. They stripped that down, and without it sounding, and this isn't, I'm not jumping to a conclusion, but in many ways, these modern yogis, I'm not going to call them gurus, but modern yogis that came from India, from these teachers in India who, okay, maybe in the 30s it wasn't as traditional as it was, dating back from that, but still, because of commercialization, and because they needed to make it attractive to the more of the masses to survive over here, they changed it a lot. So it isn't actually really that we've ruined it. It's more that those, not ruined it, but changed the practice. It's more that those, yogis from India changed the practice quite drastically in many ways.
Yes, but you could say that it's a development, and if things weren't changed, people wouldn't be practicing today, perhaps. But I think it's more people appropriating practices as appropriate for them, and then they'll say to their mate, look, much the same as today, you say, I used to have back pain, and they practice yoga, and no, I didn't have back pain anymore. That's kind of, it's obvious that chap will go, okay, so I'll take some yoga practice.
Yeah.
But if you sort of go up to someone and say, like, I'm successfully celibate now, and do that in the current climate. Sorry, what? It's
Yeah, no, you're right. That is
there's need for it, perhaps.
no, maybe they saw, maybe that was a quite judgmental thought, and it was quite a rapid thought, but maybe they saw that the need to adapt it.
But I think it's nothing's binned. The text is still available, and there's people,
Yeah, of course.
practitioners teaching, practicing like authentic, in quotes, authentic practice. But it's sort of nice that there's this availability for everyone. You don't have to be a renunciate. You don't have to give up. You're allowed to have a wife and kids and practice, and but take each case on its own. But it is a bit offensive that people that don't know any better just threw the word yoga on anything. Think of trampoline yoga, goat yoga, hula hoop yoga. Gets a bit
Puppy dog yoga.
and it's
Have you seen the puppy dog yoga?
it's but there's but again you've got the question that who gets to say what's yoga and what isn't yoga.
Exactly.
But
What is?
if you aren't practicing any of the techniques of yoga described, it's not yoga. But it becomes like everything else. It seems to be just a marketing Coca-Cola type stamp with, oh, we know what to expect. There's going to be people in silly clothes
Mm.
moving around on a mat. Oh, okay, that's yoga. So that, yeah, this, but that's not to say in an ideal world everyone would be in an ashram sitting around a fire, or
I don't think we'd be able to do that.
no,
When
it's not.
when I think back to my naivety when I first started practicing and like getting more involved with yoga, I guess I thought that everyone should be living that life, but it wouldn't be possible. Like yogis back in the day were rebels, like you were saying earlier. You know, they were very much outcasts, just as most holy men are traditionally. Like, you know, holy men were never really, or these, you know, these men who seeked a higher truth were never really popular.
Well, you had to sort of part of the course was taking yourself out of society. It wasn't compatible with you know, the texts say don't surround yourself with common people. It's clear, you know, don't associate with the bourgeoisie, if you like. And of course, like, it's not practical for Westerners or many, you know, modern practitioners anywhere to take themselves off into the forest and live in a cave or whatever. But I think perhaps there should be more of a distinction, that perhaps we do adopt this yoga
So,
different.
from your perspective, like in an ideal world, what would you like to see, like yoga centers, not yog centers, like more yoga centers doing from that more practices, more traditional practices? What practices would you like to see taught more in modern yoga studios? Do you think? What do you think would benefit society the most that we don't practice a lot of in modern yoga studios, or what isn't mentioned a lot in modern yoga studios?
Well, I'm not particularly bothered what people do. You know, they do. People can do what they like, and it's not for me to say you can't do this and do that. And
No, not at all. But what would you feel would be inspiring for people to, you know,
well, this sort of
it wasn't like, you know, what do you think should or shouldn't be done. It was more of a question of like, you know, what do you think would have a nice positive influence on people? Do you think from, you know, some of these more, I'm talking traditional text in the sense of like the Yoga Sutras even, because I don't even think people really are exposed to that information or what that is. And
well, just in terms of like the codes and the ethics and the perhaps a introduction to theory before asana practice takes place, in terms of not why you're doing this, but some prerequisites in terms of you know, not eating meat, or pursuing the correct path. But yeah, it's complicated. Perhaps, you know, a jokingly say, if you're just taking part in this sort of modern vinyasa flow class, perhaps call it a movement class, like movement and breath. Like, okay, you know, I know what I'm doing. I'm moving around a bit, because there's an argument that if you aren't practicing those other angas, those other limbs, that perhaps it's not yoga. But again, who am I to say what is and what isn't?
oh yeah,
You
so
know?
I was just interested to see what you thought.
Mm.
Hudson politely said, "Do you mean what could be brought from past yoga into modern classes that you feel is missing?" That is exactly what I meant. Thank you, Hudson. Yeah, I think Ash I got the gist of what that was. What I meant in the end.
Mm.
Do you know Ash? You're a George Orwell fan, aren't you?
No, I like Aldous Huxley
You
best.
like Aldous Huxley best. That's right.
Yeah. That's if there are any yogis watching that want to read a novel, read Aldous Huxley's Island. You know, Aldous Huxley's known for Brave New World.
Yeah.
Um, his like dystopian novel that was written in the 30s, I think. But I think Ireland was the last book he wrote, and Aldous Huxley's well known for his experiment with psychedelics and Eastern spiritual practice, and he had quite a strong he talk about moksha a lot and liberation and divine light and things like this. And this book, Ireland, there's lots of assumed knowledge, and there's everyone that got an Indian name, all the characters have got an Indian name, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, I read Ireland before I read Brave New World, because Brave New World is sort of a dystopian kind of negative
Yeah.
thing, but Ireland is like, okay, how do we? I won't spoil it, but it's sort of like, how could a society function with all these influences in terms of psychedelic liberation and Eastern spiritual practices and meditation and chanting and things. And it's a very interesting book, and Aldous Huxley was a man way before his time. He's a fascinating character.
Yeah. And did he make any predictions in that book that came to light now, or are coming to light?
In Brave New World, yes.
Not in Ireland though, because I know in Brave New World he does, but not in that Ireland book, no?
Well, it's not really that sort.
Okay, cool.
It's not that sort. It's more of a yeah, it's more sort of narrative based. It wasn't more of a traditional novel than predict the future.
I've never read that one. I have to read that one.
What were you going to say about George Orwell?
No. I thought you was George, just because I saw something on Instagram saying that I've only read Brave New World. I haven't read Orwell's one, but it said something about that he made a prediction of something similar happening with a pandemic and stuff in one of his books.
Oh, really?
Well, how accurate that is. I just saw it on Instagram, but I just thought maybe because if you was a George fan, you would have known.
I think there were a few sketchy, like people. I think people said there's a Simpsons episode where they predict this, but I knew that Simpsons predicted the Ebola.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the only people saw this coming were the scientists and like virologists, or there were people that said this is a accident waiting to happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
I've watched a few little things. I watched one on Rogan last night with a mathematician who was quite good, and he had a good. He was a economist as well, and he had a quite good view on it, and he was pretty angry, to be honest.
Yeah.
It was predicted like ages ago, and they still didn't listen.
I read somewhere that someone said, people were saying, oh, things should go back to how they were. And this chap said, no, we don't want things to go back to how they were, because how things were going, we ended up here. We need to reassess. And, it's just this thing of people eating animals. We know it's not necessary for human health. The science says a whole food plant-based diet is beneficial for human beings. And yet, throughout history, all the worst diseases come from keeping large groups of animals together. We sort of learned nothing. So I think it's a case of imposing tougher restrictions on how people keep animals together. And you see pictures from some of those wet markets in China. It's disgusting. Things stacked on top of one another, and they're defecating on each other. It's just terrible. So it was a hotbed of disease almost.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Look, I'm not against meat eaters, but the world would be a lot better if we did eat just a plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm. I think it's an education thing, isn't it? But you look at how the British diet has evolved. You look at you watch, I watched Swallows and Amazons, the old version, and Virginia McKenna makes a meal over the campfire, and she gets a thing of butter, and then she opens a thing of spam and dumps the spam in the butter and cooks it, and it gives it to this little girl, and this is great. And you think even the most ignorant person now sees, oh, maybe that's not something you should be eating. So I think it's just, a slow development. People, I think a 17-year-old approaches food very differently than a 70-year-old in England.
Yeah.
Um,
Definitely, like the development of like understanding of what a proper diet is like evolved so much in just like literally 25 years, even 20 years, even 15 years maybe.
And again, it's nothing new. Like, there are ancient texts that write about appropriate diet, and
Yeah.
the
That's not to say, by the way, that the diet has gone for the better now. I really think it's gone for the worst. Even when we were eating meat before, it was a lot more conscious, but the population of the planet wasn't as big,
Yeah, and there's
And it was less processed, of course.
factory farming things and antibiotics, and it's all really unpleasant now.
But yeah,
going back to yoga, people that claim to be yoga practitioners and then continue to eat McDonald's or whatever. Or I think we spoke about it before, the Bikram documentary on Netflix.
yeah.
Like disgusting, vile person, and there's a part where he shouts, "I eat Big Mac."
Yeah.
A perfect metaphor, isn't it?
Oh man, that documentary! Don't get me started on that. I don't know if you heard about the Kundalini kind of like exposure of Yogi Bhajan and stuff recently.
No.
Oh yeah, he got also exposed for all sorts that he was doing. Like he has one of the biggest private kind of security companies in America.
Oh.
NASA use his company, it's called Akashi Protection or something, or something like that, or Akashi, I can't remember now. Anyway, Akashi Weapons, I think, and they protect NASA's base.
Yeah.
It's crazy, man. Honestly, I've read some crazy stuff about Yogi Bhajan recently. It made what the stuff about Swami Vishnu seem light. It made it seem light.
It's it's odd, isn't it? There's so many. I think it's safe to say that most modern yoga gurus, there's some hideous abuse scandal associated with them all. You think it's not just it's abuse. It's not sort of recreational while everyone's having fun and they had a girlfriend on the side. This is abuse, which is disgusting when it's coming from anyone, obviously, but particularly when it's coming from someone that's supposed to embody all this yoga practice. It's
Although
odd.
they use everything, it's odd. But I think it's a discussion for another time. But the more I reflect on it, I feel more and more saddened. But then I'm filled with joy because there's a lot of modern practitioners who are really practicing the traditional values and still sticking by that, and they're positive influence. So, there's positive that have come from these people at the same time. But going back to just one last quick question before we wrap up, have you had any thoughts about like when you go back to teaching, how that's going to feel, being around people and like teaching people yoga? I've been thinking about it a lot today and yesterday.
No, I think for everyone in terms of perhaps one-to-ones will be fine and smaller group classes will be fine, but I think we'll just be slightly more cautious of huge, big classes, and same as going to the theatre or something. I think if there's more than about 5 people, we begin to get freaked out. But I think it's just a case of practicing good hygiene and being appropriate with adjustments and things. And I think we'll perhaps be a bit cautious to begin with, and then slowly develop, but yeah, I think we just perhaps be a bit cautious of more than about 5 people, but yeah, sort of people that aren't motivated to take a home practice, I think we're going to look forward to sort of genuine sort of one-on-one teaching. There's only so much you can do behind a screen.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think people will be looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. I'll be looking forward to it. I'll be looking forward to teaching people in the flesh again.
I don't know how long we've got there.
No, I know. Who knows? But at the moment, we can just sit back and.
I read a thing, the actual definition of quarantine is 40 days. You hear this?
No.
Yeah, it comes from when they used to do trading on the boats. A boat would have to drop anchor and stay away from the port for 40 days for quarantine. And it makes sense because like you've got all these other, quad bike, meaning for quarantine, it's from the Latin. And that's 14th century that we understood keep these people away from those people to avoid disease. But it's one of those many words that has been. I like that a couple of weeks ago it was self-isolation. It was like, sounded serious and a bit heavy, and now it's stay home. Okay, I can stay home. It's not a big deal, It's better, isn't it? It seems odd that I was laughing that the same people that are stressed out at work and they were saying, I'm looking forward to the weekend or my holiday leave or something. Obviously, there's the financial difficulties, but the government are literally saying, don't go to work, stay at home, and people are stressing about what to do. It's kind of interesting seeing people having time to reflect and sit there. And
yeah, I think it's amazing. I think it's part of that. Like,
to take up yoga practice, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think it's almost like, I know we've talked about the how people define yoga now, but I actually think this is a yoga practice in itself. It's making people outside. It's making people live basically. I think it's not as different for me. I kind of live like this all the time, but at the same time, I think it's brilliant because people are like now reflecting a little bit and taking that time to stop. And that is what yoga is. It's creating that union between the body and the mind and the spirit. And that's what this is forcing people to do. It's forcing people to just be like, whoa, okay, I'm going to be with my own thoughts for a moment, experience boredom.
Yeah. Hopefully, let the mind reset a bit.
Yeah. Come up with what you need to come up with. Well, it's been nice chatting, Ash. I think maybe we should definitely have a go at this again and, pick a little area of discussion.
Yeah, I tend to go off on a tangent.
No, perfect. I think it's a perfect introductory sit down. As always, we could always go on forever. I like the fact we can just throw it out there. Hudson already put in the chat saying he loved it. And he's going to catch up with the rest tomorrow. We'll be posting this up online, so give it a little share eventually.
Thank you.
But people can find you on at Ash Barrett Yoga, isn't it, on Instagram?
Yeah, Ash Barrett. I think it's .yoga. I'm sure it'll come up or find me through Yoga Factory page or something. Not difficult to find.
And you're still doing one-to-ones, aren't you? You're doing online one-to-ones?
Yes, as best I can, sort of find a practice that's appropriate for individual.
Yeah, so we'll get, if you want a little online one-to-one, I'm sure Ash will be happy to. And we want to keep popping on here and talking a little bit more about these more interesting subjects around yoga and exposing a little bit of the history. So if anyone has anything that they want us to talk about that they've always been unclear on, then throw it out there, and I'm sure we'll be more than happy to have an open discussion about it to our best ability. We're just people seeking just as everyone else is. So thanks, Ash.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening.
See you soon.
Enjoy your freedom. Blessings, brother.
Bye bye.